Prittwitz was also fighting to defend the lands of many German army officers from the old Junker estates in East Prussia. These estates had produced Prussian officers since the 17th century, and he had no interest in seeing those lands destroyed or looted by the Russians, hence his desire, as you can see here on the map, to pull back. Prittwitz's Eighth Army was actually comprised primarily of soldiers from Prussia, and they knew the lay of the land, and they knew it very, very well. And they were also willing to fight very hard to hold on to it. In one such case, during the Battle of Tannenberg, an artillery officer by the name of Emil Hell was forced to direct his guns first against his hometown and then against his own house. But these men had walked these areas during army maneuvers time and time again, and in many cases, some of them knew the towns, the villages, and even the forests in these areas, which proved very, very useful in their attempts to drive back the Russians. General von Moltke in the West was never the calmest man in the German army, and he was already faced with a number of problems on the Western Front, and so therefore he decided to relieve Prittwitz of command. In his place, Moltke called upon General Paul von Hindenburg, who was brought out of retirement. Hindenburg, who you see here, would later become the president of Germany and the man who paved the way for Hitler to become chancellor of Germany. At the time he was brought out of retirement, he was 64 years old. He was named as the commander of the Eighth Army to be sent to Prussia. Retirement didn't suit him, and he was eager to get back in uniform. The only thing was he'd put on a little bit of weight, and he needed to get a new field gray uniform before his orders came in. He was the consummate conservative Prussian soldier and Junker. Moltke chose as Hindenburg's chief of staff Erich von Ludendorff, who you also see in the picture here, the new star of the German army. Ludendorff had almost single-handedly captured the citadel at Liège when he walked up to the door, banged on it, and ordered the garrison to surrender. For his bravery or his insanity, he was given one of the highest honors in the German army, the Pour le Mérite. A commoner who worked incredibly hard to rise up through the ranks, he was being moved from the Western to the Eastern Front to join into what became the war's most successful partnership. As one German officer noted in his diary, Ludendorff was a first-class fellow to work with. He was the right man for the business, ruthless and hard. Even his superior Hindenburg had great praise for his second, describing Ludendorff's intellectual powers and his almost superhuman capacity for work. When the two met at Hanover Station, it might be something right out of Jerry Maguire. They didn't know that each would complete the other. Hindenburg was calm, cool, and collected, while Ludendorff was brilliant, energetic, and high-strung. When Hindenburg would sleep away most of the night, Ludendorff would remain up, planning and worrying. Hindenburg was the balance to Ludendorff, and their efforts over the course of the war produced Germany's greatest victories, but in the end, her ultimate defeat. Even today, we know that opposites are often the best pairings where business or entertainment partnerships are concerned, and this was just one of those partnerships. The Hindenburg-Ludendorff partnership was immediately put to work on the Eastern Front. They did not have to formulate the plan for the attack on Samsonov's Second Army. Hoffman had already set that in motion where the Eighth Army was concerned. The two did, however, have to manage those forces in battle, and they did so with stunning success. What played out in the last days of August and the beginning of September of 1914 were described by Hindenburg in his memoir as a series of scenes. In those scenes, the Germans surrounded and then destroyed an entire Russian army in one of the greatest victories in military history. The Battle of Tannenberg saw the encirclement and capture of much of Samsonov's army. The Germans took 92,000 prisoners, and the Russians suffered 50,000 casualties. German casualties by First World War standards were light at 13,000 men. So devastating was the defeat that General Samsonov rode into the forest and shot himself. The battle took place 30 kilometers from Tannenberg, but Ludendorff suggested to Hindenburg that the battle be named for the same battle in which a Polish-Lithuanian force had defeated the Teutonic Knights in 1410. This new Battle of Tannenberg would be a vindication for that battle, a defeat by the Slavs, of the Slavs by the Germans, and a rallying cry now for the German nation. After the war, the country would dedicate a great monument to Tannenberg, which you see here in the slide. In 1934, following his death, Hindenburg's body was interred at the monument, where it remained until 1945. As the Russian armies neared Tannenberg in 1945, Hitler had Hindenburg's body disinterred and the monument dynamited. Following Tannenberg, Hinden soon became a national icon. Wooden statues of Hindenburg, iron or nail men as they were known, were erected and moved from town to town. Nails were driven into them when contributions were made to the German Red Cross. These, along with other propaganda, like this postcard, raised the name of Hindenburg to that of a cult hero during the war. Even the wartime industrial and social programs instituted in 1917-18 were named for Hindenburg, and the defensive line on the Western Front, also known as the Siegfried Line, was nicknamed the Hindenburg Line. But the fight against the Russians was not completely over. As Hoffman had planned it, once Samsonov's army was defeated in the south, the Germans would turn their attention toward Rennenkampf's army in the north. They did so in the second week of September in the Battle of Masurian Lakes. Again, the Germans were almost able to encircle the Russians, but this time Rennenkampf recognized the threat and quickly retreated into Russia. Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes proved significant victories in the east, victories that the Germans celebrated. And in a strange way, it was actually, some ways, the kind of Schlieffen plan in reverse. Whereas the plan had been to defeat the French first and then the Russians, the battles had seemed to have, at least for now, defeated the Russians instead. Stalemate may have been the situation on the Western Front, but on the Eastern Front, Germany looked to have the upper hand over the Russians. Now Germany could choose to either remain on the defensive in East Prussia or go on the offensive. Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes were not a complete setback for the Russians. While they had been a defeat, the Russians still had strong armies in the south massing to attack the Austrians. It's interesting to note that though the war began in the Balkans, it was almost turning into a sideshow even as the war was just beginning. The Austrians, and particularly Conrad, had argued that the war offered them the opportunity to put Serbia in her place, to finally, once and for all, remove the threat by seizing Belgrade and cutting off the head of the Serbian snake. Just as the Russians were forced to determine the best use of their forces though the emperor was supposed to play that role in both countries, Franz Joseph was simply too old to carry out such tasks. Franz Ferdinand would have been selected, of course, but he was no longer around. The emperor chose instead Archduke Friedrich. While the Archduke had an impressive military pedigree, his grandfather, Archduke Karl, had won the Battle of Aspern against Napoleon. Archduke Friedrich proved less capable than his ancestors, and he really left it up to Conrad to run the Austrian army. That meant that war policy was very much in the hands of the military, and not controlled by ministers of the emperor. In effect, it was Conrad's war. Consequently, while wary of the Russians, Conrad wanted to put the Serbs in their place. This meant that he had to split his forces, and he gave General Potiorek in the Balkans 460,000 men to do just that, to dispatch the Serbs, while Conrad dealt with the Russians according to Plan R in Galicia. Potiorek had been governor of Bosnia, but he hadn't done much of a job there, as evidenced by the handling of the Archduke's assassination. In fact, as a soldier, he never commanded a division, little less an army. And the army itself would be an inexperienced one, composed of members of the Landstrom, which were the lowest level of reserves. This might be the best time to make mention of the Austro-Hungarian army. When war broke out, many men rushed to join the ranks, so many that the Austro-Hungarian army lacked weapons and uniforms to outfit them. Prior to the war, it had the lowest manpower ratio of any of the major participants. Only 1 in 132 men in the empire was a soldier, as compared to 1 in 94 in Germany and 1 in 98 in Russia. Arguments between the Hungarian parliament and the Austrian parliament over budgets meant that the army went into the war lacking adequate supplies of artillery, the most important weapon of the war. The Russians, for example, had more and much better artillery. They could fire at the Austrians from a range of 5 miles, while the Austrians, using outdated bronze guns, could only fire at a range of about 2 miles. This meant that Austrian infantry were at a great disadvantage when the war opened, and often succumbed to Russian heavy artillery before they were in sight of the Russian infantry. The only thing that the Austrians had in their favor was the Russians were constantly short of ammunition. The Austrians lacked any real mechanized transport or airplanes or reconnaissance, relying instead on horses for supply and cavalry to reconnoiter the enemy. This was a very difficult task, of course, in the great expanses of the Russian front. On top of everything else, the Austrian army was inefficient, weighed down by endless paperwork, memos, and reports. However, far more important for them was title, rank, and social status within the army, which favored the German-speaking Austrians over the rest of the empire's nationalities. The Czechs, for instance, furnished a number of officers for the army, but they were never allowed to reach the rank of general, which no doubt made them resentful and hardly eager to innovate. Pay in the Austrian-Hungarian army was even worse, with a major, possibly with 25 years of service, making the same amount as a Viennese school teacher. Older, higher-ranking men were stuck in the mindset of the 19th century, like their emperor, and many of these men were considered bumbling idiots as representative of the Austrian army maneuvers in the pre-war period. Lousing up an exercise was one thing, but taking troops into battle led by such men was to have terrible consequences for the Austrians throughout the war. Another story of their incompetence involves Tyrolean mountain troops sent to fight against the Russians in the early days of the war, complete with all their mountain gear, since their officers refused to fill out the paperwork before they left the Tyrol. So these soldiers marched into battle, often lengthy marches, some carrying ice picks, ropes, and wearing heavy hobnailed boots that sank into the sandy soil in Galicia. Like their counterparts in Germany, Russia, Britain, and France, volunteers in 1914 did so for various reasons: patriotism, the spirit of adventure, to become men, to cast off their past, to shape themselves into new men. And it was not just Austrian Germans who volunteered. Ukrainians, Jews, Swiss, Italians, Montenegrins living within the empire all volunteered for service. The Austrian army was a polyglot army before the war, and it remained so during the war. While there may have been willing recruits rushing to join the ranks, not all of the subjects in the empire were willing to lay down their lives for Franz Joseph. While volunteers might be infused with patriotism, conscripts often did desert. During the war, Czechs deserted to the Russian army and were able to create their own legion, which would play an important role in the Russian Civil War. Of all the major armies, the Austro-Hungarian was probably the worst fighting force of all those involved. Its officers were members of the aristocracy, its soldiers came from the peasantry. The general staff was completely out of touch with common soldiers, and the divide was great, with officers living in luxury, many of them with connections at court, and they used their soldiers as their footmen and made sure that their dinners were served on expensive plate, often under candlelight, with a female companion never far off. Language proved a real problem within the Austro-Hungarian army as well, leading to clashes sometimes between the different nationalities. Orders often had to be translated, which took extra time. In one instance, early in the fighting in Galicia, Hungarian troops received their orders in German, translated them into Magyar, and then sent the orders to their troops who did, in fact, not understand Hungarian. The soldiers, typified by Yaroslav Hasik's The Good Soldier Schweik, in that book, a very humorous work, we see an example of soldiers that Hasek encountered during his time in the army. Schweik is a Czech, and he is, as the book often reminds us, an idiot. But again, he also seems to be surrounded by idiots within the Austro-Hungarian army and within the Austro-Hungarian general staff as well. Now, obviously, we can't use this to paint a picture of the entire Austro-Hungarian army, but it was not the most effective fighting force in World War I, as we will see. Norman Stone, whose work on the war on the Eastern Front is still considered a classic study of the fighting there, asserts that when the war began, there was a great muddle on the Austro-Hungarian side. That muddle centered on the role that the Germans would play in support of the Austrians. Now, you need to remember back to the blank check. Well, it appears the Austrians believed that support from the Germans would come in the form of military support, military aid, when the war commenced. This was something that the Germans were, at this point, unwilling to provide because it didn't fit into their plans with either the Schlieffen Plan or what Moltke planned for the German army in the East. The Austrians would have to go it alone for now and wait for support from the Germans, at least until East Prussia was secured. One needs to keep in mind that even though they were allies, the Germans and the Austrians did not share their war plans. In the pre-war period, the case in which an Austrian colonel by the name of Radl had sold secrets to the Russians had offered the Germans ample reason not to give their plans to the Austrians. Consequently, when the war broke out, key partners in the Triple Alliance were actually working separately rather than in conjunction with one another. Konrad von Hotzendorf had sworn to deal swiftly with the Serbs and also to deal swiftly with the Russians, who posed a much greater threat as they directed 3 armies against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia. This meant that Konrad had to split his forces, even going so far as to call the Second Army back from the Bosnian front to send it to Galicia. This proved to be a logistical nightmare as trains headed for Serbia were then rerouted back towards the east. The problem with Konrad, and there were a number of problems with Konrad, were that he was terribly indecisive. He simply did not like making decisions because decisions would limit his future options, he proclaimed. When decisions turned out to be wrong ones, he simply put the blame on his subordinates, notably Pretoriak in Serbia. As one historian notes, Konrad was more showman than strategist. He would have to fight both Serbia and Russia at the same time, something that he simply lacked the abilities and the armies to carry out successfully. Konrad wished to win favor with the emperor and his mistress, and he and Pretoriak were far more interested in warring with each other than with the Serbs. It is said of Pretoriak, that his desk was his favored terrain. He boasted that he would simply wipe out the Serbs, killing them to the last man. Another serious consideration we need to take into account is whether Conrad's actions were affected by a desire to please his mistress, Gina von Renninghaus. As the Austrian campaigns began, she sent him what many might consider a very strange gift, a locket with a picture of Helmut von Moltke the Elder, the Prussian general who'd actually been responsible for the defeat of the Austrians at Königgrätz in 1866. He apparently wore it around his neck. Unfortunately, this talisman didn't really work that well, though Conrad eventually did win over Gina. The desire to defeat the Serbs may have also been influenced by the desire to win over Gina. And again, this is a strange sort of aspect of the war, but one does have to ask whether or not Conrad was driven to attack the Serbs and to defeat the Serbs by his desire to win over his mistress. As I said, they did eventually marry, so he got that wish, but in the long run, he didn't win the war. Facing the Austrians was a Serb army that was very experienced following the two recent Balkan wars. The Serbian commander, who you see here, Radomir Putnik, had 400,000 men at his disposal. 185,000 of those were well-trained veterans. He'd been able to mobilize his forces efficiently and to establish fairly effective defenses. However, apart from this first levy of his army, the remainder lacked uniforms and modern rifles. He also lacked machine guns and horses for the cavalry and supply. His rolling stock and coal were also in short supply. Rather than taking Belgrade, which meant forging the fast-moving Danube, Conrad decided to direct his attacks on Serbia from Bosnia and the western frontier. And this is what Potiorek did and failed miserably in mid-August. When the battle opened, the heat of the summer was intolerable for the new recruits. They faced a non-stop battle from the Serbs with little water, leading many to suffer from heat exhaustion. The Serbs had no intention of allowing the Austrians to simply walk across their border. They were going to put up a fight, aided by the fact that in pre-war maneuvers, the Austrians had been discouraged from digging trenches, as it was considered cowardly. When faced with a hail of bullets from well-equipped and well-emplaced Serb forces, the Austrians were forced to dig in either with their rifle butts or with their fingers. Consequently, initial Austrian attacks were sent packing by the Serbs. A second attack, further to the north in early September, was equally disastrous, the Austrians losing 23,000 men and 600 officers. Allies of the Serbs joyfully reported the Austrian setback, claiming Franz Joseph's army has covered itself in ridicule. To offset the bad press, the Austrians assured their allies that all was fine and that they were winning the war. At this point, the Serbs went on the offensive at the behest of the Russians and invaded Bosnia, hoping to create an uprising in that country, but the invasion amounted to little, and support from the inside of the country did not bring about the uprising that Putnik had wished for. Victory at this point had gone to the Serbs. The Austrians had failed to assert their superiority in the Balkans or to punish or tame the Serbs. The Austrians had also failed to understand the nature of modern warfare, notably the use of heavy artillery to saturate areas. At the same time, when they moved forward, the Austrians huddled together in mass, making them easy targets for Serb guns. Austrians simply blazed away with their guns at the Serbs, who were hiding behind trees and rocks or in trenches, as I just showed you, before they ended up running out of ammunition. They then launched disorganized bayonet attacks against fixed positions and were simply cut down by the Serbs. The Austrians quickly lost support of any local populations as well by marauding and killing Serb villagers who they accused of partisan attacks. There were waves of atrocities unleashed against the Serb population. the result of years of tension between the two sides. Even as proper Austrian officers complained about their conduct, the regular soldiers often failed to listen. Other officers justified the slaughter of civilians, claiming in social Darwinist terms that the Serbs were, and I quote, a culturally backward people. Based on what we've already talked about where the rape of Belgium is concerned, it's important to keep in mind that atrocities in the Second World War have their roots in the First World War. If Plan B didn't work, then neither did Plan R. On the Galician front, things went from bad to worse for Conrad. The Germans hoped that his attacks on the Russians might weaken them further, but this was not to be the case. Conrad, of course, now wished more than ever to win a great victory in the field, if not to prove to his allies that the Austrians could pull their weight, but also to prove that he was a great warrior to his Jena. While he would end up winning over Jena, as I said, the Russians on the Galician front proved to be less loving. The Russians outnumbered the Austrians in both men and artillery nearly 2-1. In an attempt to win over the Poles and the Ukrainians, Conrad issued documents promising to free them from the Russian yoke. However, that could only be done if the Russian armies were defeated, and Conrad and the Austrians looked ill-equipped for the task. But that is not to say that the Russians were any better off. They had even fewer automobiles than the Austrians, some fewer than 700 vehicles for an army of several million men. In late August, the two armies collided, and as in the West, these free-flowing battles resulted in terrible casualties on both sides. One of the problems was that the Austrian troops were so eager to fight that they often engaged the Russians before artillery support arrived and were cut down by Russian infantry and field artillery. One Austrian officer, who you see here, Colonel Ludwig Holzhausen, when attacking the Russians in Poland, stood up, drew his saber to urge his men to attack, and was simply shot down. He was described by his fellow officers as having been crazy brave, with a death-defying attitude. Losses naturally began to mount, so Conrad called on the Germans to send reinforcements, something he would do throughout the war. Conrad, of course, refused to take blame himself, stating that his intelligence services were not up to the task, nor was his cavalry. He ascribed the losses and the behavior of his soldiers to the fact that, and I quote, Austrians are a people of chivalrous selflessness, and that was causing so many deaths at the front. But much of the blame should have fallen firmly on the shoulders of Conrad, who seemed to have little control over what was occurring on the Galician front. Conrad's command could be summed up in one word: chaotic. As one historian, Holger Helvig, noted, the Austrians showed more bravery than sense. As they had done in Serbia, they charged the Russians, bayonets drawn, as though they were fighting in Napoleon's day. The costs were great. The Fourth Army lost half its officers and a quarter of its rank-and-file troops. After all of this, Conrad seemed to be more worried about whether his faults as a commander would cost him his mistress rather than lead to the collapse of the front. Nor could Conrad understand why the Poles or the Ukrainians of the Galicia had not greeted the Austrians as liberators. In fact, it seemed that they were helping the Russians instead. Reports were coming in that Russian troops were being helped by local intelligentsia, priests, and school teachers to sight their machine guns from church towers, while women were sheltering the Russian wounded and helping them find civilian clothes to escape the clutches of the Austrians. Each of the three armies that the Austrians threw against the Russians seemed ill-suited to the task, and during the Battle of Lemberg, the Third Army retreated, leaving behind its equipment, as well as many as 8,000 rifles. A number of generals suffered nervous breakdowns. Officers, rather than organizing their men, often were too drunk to carry out even the simplest orders, and as a whole, discipline broke down and units retreated back towards the border. To add insult to injury, the Russians overran Galicia and the fortress town of Przemysl and took 10,000 Austrian prisoners. This left the door open to the Russians moving into Hungary, but they were forced to halt their progress owing to a large number of casualties that they too had suffered. By this time, the Austro-Hungarian army had lost 100,000 dead, 220,000 wounded, and another 100,000 prisoners, and this is just in the first year of the war. The Serbs had not been beaten, the Russians had not been beaten, and it looked as though the war was not going to be a short one. To make matters worse, the army was hit by an outbreak of influenza that further decimated the ranks. Even Conrad lost one of his sons in the fighting. Panic gripped Vienna, but Franz Joseph refused to accept that this was the end, stating that, and I quote, "Today's unlucky commander may well be victorious tomorrow." At this point in the proceedings, that did not seem possible for the Austro-Hungarians. The army was in tatters, and Conrad had few ideas about how to rebuild it. The only answer seemed to be German assistance, and a lot of it. But that wouldn't come until the French were defeated, or, as we'll find out later, the Germans grudgingly gave in to Conrad.